Well, tonight we're focusing on a new trend in the field of artificial intelligence that seems more like science fiction than real life. It involves developing AI versions or avatars of human beings, sometimes called grief bots, so that after someone dies, their loved ones can continue to interact with AI representations of the person they lost. At least that's the idea, and it's fraught with many ethical questions having to do with the human experience and how humans experience death and grief. We're going to talk to an expert about all of this in just a moment. But first, here's a report from France 24's Selina Sykes.
When Michael Bommer found out that he was terminally ill with colon cancer, he spent a lot of time speaking with his wife about what would happen after his death.
She said, Michael, one of the things I'm really going to miss is talking to you, the sound of your voice.
That sparked an idea for Bommer. With the help of a friend based in the US, it took the 61-year-old entrepreneur 2 months to build an interactive AI version of himself.
We have you say 300 different phrases that capture, I'll call it your emotional voice. So sometimes you say, I love you, or you say, I love you. And they say, oh, the door's open. And we capture all that, and then we compress all that and make an AI out of it.
Bommer's AI voice, which cost $15,000 to set up, can answer questions and tell stories without regurgitating pre-recorded answers. He's excited about his digital immortality. His wife, however, is more apprehensive.
I think to myself, I'd rather be sitting here with his favourite jumper, with a glass of wine, than feel the need to talk to the AI. To begin with, I think. But like I said, who knows?
The rise of grief tech comes with many ethical questions. Should those grieving use AI to interact with lost loved ones without their consent? And despite providing comfort during a difficult time, could it prevent people from moving on?
Well, so where is this technology heading and what can we make of it? For more on this, I'm joined by Tomasz Hollanek, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24. First of all, tell us where the evolution of this technology stands at the moment, because when I first read this report, I realized it is exactly the plot of an episode from the science fiction series Black Mirror, when a woman tragically loses her husband, and then after his death, she begins to interact with an AI version of him. So how evolved is the technology in real life at this point?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. As you mentioned, the rise of grief bots does remind us of some science fiction scenarios. And the truth is that with the revolution in generative AI, these technologies are becoming possible for anyone right now. So we can see a huge revolution in the market, or what we call the digital afterlife industry, which has grown into its own market segment. And we can identify two types of companies, and there are new companies emerging. Since we started working on this last year, we have seen a few bigger ones, and there are multiple smaller ones that are emerging, not only in Europe and the US, but also in China, India. And there are two types of companies. Some offer a form of immortalization to people who are still alive and who would like to preserve themselves in this form for their loved ones. In other words, shaping their own legacy in this way, preserving themselves as a form of AI-powered avatar. And there are other types of companies that focus more specifically on people who lost someone and who would like to reconnect with that person. And of course, both of these types of companies and the emerging dead bots, chat bots, grief bots, postmortem avatars come with different types of risks: ethical, social, even environmental.
Well, that leads to my next question. What are the dangers or consequences of using this technology from a psychological standpoint? I imagine it would totally change the grieving process or even stop it altogether.
So I think when thinking about risks related to these technologies, we have to differentiate between two or even three stakeholder groups. So we can think of what we, in our recent study, call data donors, so people whose data powers the creation of these dead bots. And when we're thinking about the risks associated with the creation of dead bots, when we're thinking about this stakeholder group, we can think of, for instance, violating a person's post-mortem privacy or the right to their post-mortem privacy when a dead bot is created without that person's consent. We can also think about how a creation of a dead bot without that person's consent, when it's used, for instance, for advertising purposes, which is right now legal possible, how these use cases could undermine that person's dignity. And then, of course, we can think of the impact on the person who's using the dead bot or grief bot. And as you say, risks related to grief are, to the grieving process are definitely one of the most important ones. Since grief is a particularly vulnerable state, so we can see how if these technologies are not designed in an ethical way, they could be used, for instance, for manipulation. But we can also think of risks that are not necessarily related only to the state of grieving or the prolongation of grief or not processing grief. This is obviously a possibility, although we don't really have enough studies to determine to what extent this impact could be positive and negative, and what could be shaping it. So in many ways, we are speculating here as these technologies are rolled out on the market right now as we speak.
Right, because there are no long-term studies on what effects this might have. As a researcher in this field, how do you grapple with this just as a human being yourself? Because this obviously raises some really big ethical questions. Do you think enough is being done to regulate AI as it evolves at such a rapid pace?
So there is a lot of promise when it comes to regulation, in particular in the EU. We have now seen the development of the first comprehensive piece of legislation, the AI Act, recently approved by the European Parliament. And there is a lot of hope related to this regulation. However, the AI Act does not specifically address this kind of use case. So the interpretation of whether this could be interpreted as the so-called high risk or permissible risk technology is really up to the companies. And I think in particular with my co-author of the study, Kasia Nowaczyk-Basińska, we do believe that more regulation should be targeting these specific types of technologies precisely because their impact on a person's psychological well-being is still not certain.
Where could this technology be headed? Because, in that episode of Black Mirror that I mentioned, a clone was eventually made of the husband who was killed. I mean, this may seem like a ridiculous question, but could we actually be headed in the direction of clones, or will that just remain something we see in science fiction?
We are definitely heading in the direction of the illusion of clones as AI is getting better and better and mimicking our voice, our speech patterns. That's definitely, so the illusion of cloning people, so to speak, is definitely on the horizon, and if it's not already here. But in terms of where it's heading, we can see some positive scenarios. So, for instance, there are experiments currently going on in building so-called interactive biographies of Holocaust survivors. So this is something that I think we can identify as a positive scenario, as a positive use case of these technologies and how they could preserve testimonies and people's experiences. On the other hand, we can also see how this could go in the very strange direction. For instance, how we could become socially but also economically active or remain economically active after our death. So if you're a writer, you could in some sense keep producing works after you die, and the proceeds from this could be given to your family members. So this is quite speculative, but there is definitely a lot of potential, but also a lot of risk.
Well, just today, a group of employees at AI companies published an open letter calling for AI firms, including OpenAI, to establish greater transparency and more protections for whistleblowers. Do you think that AI companies are doing enough to set some boundaries for themselves so that this technology does not sort of spiral out of control?
I think in general it's difficult to speak at large because different companies will have different standards. So Anthropic will be very different for OpenAI when it comes to standards. But in general, I do believe that we cannot leave it just up to the developers of these technologies. We do need stronger and more precise regulation, in particular as the possibility of manipulating people. And when you're thinking about grief bots, the scope for manipulation is extreme. That's why I do think that we cannot just believe that companies will be doing enough. Having said this, in our report, we do focus specifically on recommendations for designers and developers. So not recommendations for regulators. We suggest we do give companies some ideas for what they could be doing to ensure that what they are already producing is not harming people.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your insight. Tomasz Hollanek, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. Thanks so much for your insight. That's it for now. We're back with more World News.